There are two patterns in this issue that use slip stitches. Let's talk about them. When you're slipping a stitch, there are a couple of different variables. The first is which way you put the needle in. Do you put the needle in as if to knit, or do you put the needle in as if to purl? The second variable is where the yarn goes. Is it at the back, or is it at the front? When you're slipping the stitch in the middle of a row for a slip stitch heel pattern, for some kind of colorwork pattern, you're generally slipping as if to purl like this, because that preserves the stitch orientation. That keeps the right leg of the stitch at the front where it would be normally for conventional Western style knitting. And so in general, if you see an instruction to slip a stitch, it is as if to purl. But that says nothing about where the yarn is. If you're working in stockinette stitch, as I am here, and I'm on the knit side, in general, when I'm slipping a stitch, you would leave the yarn in the appropriate position for the row. So in this case, this is a knit row, right? The yarn is at the back. And so I would slip as if to purl, but that doesn't mean you bring the yarn to the front. Yarn stays in knit position, put the needle in as if to purl. That preserves the stitch orientation and it leaves the float, the yarn that sits unused, at the wrong side of the work. On the purl side, if I'm slipping a stitch when I'm facing the wrong side of my stockinette stitch, then I am going to slip as if to purl, that is put the needle in the stitch as if to purl, and my yarn is in purl position. My yarn is in purl position because I'm on the purl side of the fabric. So we sometimes slip stitches at the beginning of a row. You might do it in a shawl, in a scarf, edges of a heel flap of a sock too. So how do you deal with that? If you're working in stockinette stitch, it's slipping purlwise once again to keep the stitch oriented properly, and you leave the yarn in the appropriate position for the row. So here I'm facing a knit row, and so I'm going to put the needle in purlwise, but do you see how I'm leaving the yarn at the back? And so that means that the yarn is not getting caught around the edge, and you get this lovely, I hope that you can see that, clean edge there. So on the purl side, on the wrong side of your stockinette, you've got that clean edge again, and to create that, it's again slip purlwise, but the yarn is in the appropriate position for the row. So the yarn is in the front. In garter, there's a subtlety though. To get that clean line, we have to approach it a little bit differently. In this case, no matter what side you're on, and well, what is the right side and the wrong side, you're always knitting. We're still going to slip as if to purl. You're getting the idea here. It's always slip as if to purl in these contexts. But in this case, even though we're effectively on a knit row, I want you to leave the yarn in the front. And so that what you do, and it's tough to do here with these big needles, after you've slipped, I'm going to bring the working yarn to the back. And what that does, let me knit a stitch here. What that does is it takes the purl bump into the middle. It sort of swings the stitch around so that you can see the chain of the edge. And maybe I'll undo that so you can see that again now that I've described it. Okay, I'm going to slip with the yarn in front, and once I move the yarn to the back, do you see what it's doing? It's pulling that stitch, it's twisting the edge stitch so that the chain of the knit side is visible. Because that's the funny thing about edge stitches, right? They're both a knit and a purl depending on which way they're positioned. So at the edge of garter stitch in a shawl or a scarf, we slip purlwise with the yarn in front so that you get that nice chain edge. And in a pattern, what you might see is you might see an abbreviation, WYIF, WYIB, stands for with yarn in front or with yarn in back. And that will be used as a modifier on that slip instruction, slip one with yarn in front, or slip one with yarn in back, just to be clear so you get the effect the designer intended. We also slip stitches in the context of decreases. There's SSK, SKP, S2K, you get the idea, right? Lots of decreases use slips. In that case, it's a knitwise slip. And the reason we slip knitwise is actually to reposition the stitch, to bring the left leg to the front so that when it gets lifted over, because that's effectively what's happening with these slip decreases, this is the SKP, you lift over and you do not want the stitch on top twisted. And so in any of those decreases, SKP, SSK, SSP, you name it, all of those slips are knitwise. There's one exception, because there always is, and that is some people like to do their SSK with the second slip as if to purl. First one as if to knit, second as if to purl. And what that does is when you're completing the SSK, it twists the lower stitch and tightens up the decrease a little. Some people prefer the line of that and how that looks. Either's fine, they both work. The important thing in the context of a decrease is that first slip must always be as if to knit.